Okay, so when you picture President Theodore Roosevelt, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's one of two powerful, almost contradictory images, right? You've got the rugged conservationist, the guy who protected America's natural wonders. And then you've got the fierce trust buster, who went toe-to-toe with the biggest corporations in the world. In this explainer, we're going to dive into how these two legacies really tell the story of a debate that's been at the heart of American capitalism for over 125 years.
So let's set the scene. The year is 1903. President Roosevelt is out camping in Yosemite with the famous naturalist John Muir. And I mean, he's really camping, sleeping under the stars on a pile of 40 wool blankets, just talking freely around a campfire. Now, this trip wasn't just some getaway. It was a defining moment. It really cemented Roosevelt's identity as this great protector of the American landscape, leading him to say that this kind of majestic beauty, it has to be preserved, untouched for all time.
But here's the thing. At the exact same time, a totally different Roosevelt was hard at work. While one side of him was creating national parks and protecting forests, the other side was suing 44 of the nation's most powerful corporations. We're talking about breaking up massive railroad trusts and taking on the absolute behemoth that was Standard Oil. This just screams tension, right? And it makes you ask a pretty fundamental question. What does it really mean to protect a nation? Is it about preserving its physical beauty, or is it about reining in concentrated economic power?
To really get the trustbuster side of him, we have to go back to what antitrust was all about in the first place. See, it wasn't just about economics. It was deeply political. It was about protecting people from power that had grown way too big.
First off, what even was a trust? Well, it started out as a pretty clever legal tool. Imagine a bunch of business owners agreeing to hand over control of their companies to a single board of trustees. In return, they'd get a cut of the massive profits. But in the late 1800s, guys like John D. Rockefeller basically weaponized this idea to create giant monopolies that could control entire industries, set any price they wanted, and just crush any competition.
And so, the response to these all-powerful trusts was, well, antitrust. These were the laws designed specifically to fight back, to act as a counterbalance to all that concentrated power, and to make sure that markets stayed competitive and fair for everyone, not just a handful of giants. And boy, did this happen fast. The Sherman Act in 1890 was the first big shot fired. Then, during the Progressive Era, things really kicked into high gear. You had the Supreme Court breaking up Standard Oil in 1911, and by 1914, two more huge laws, the Clayton Act and the FTC Act, gave the government even more firepower to police corporate behavior.
The whole idea behind this movement was captured perfectly by a guy who would later become a Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. He warned of the curse of bigness. See, for Brandeis and other progressives, the problem wasn't just that monopolies could jack up prices. The real deep fear was that so much economic power in so few hands was a direct threat to democracy itself.
But then, everything changed. In the second half of the 20th century, a total revolution in thinking happened. The entire philosophy behind antitrust was basically turned on its head.
This is the question that flipped the script. A new way of thinking emerged that asked, hey, what if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if being big actually makes companies more efficient? And what if the one and only goal of antitrust should be making sure prices are low for you, the consumer?
And this idea gave birth to what's known as the Consumer Welfare Standard. Suddenly, the goal of antitrust did a complete 180. It went from this broad concern about the political power of big companies to a single, laser-focused metric, economic efficiency. And how is that measured? Pretty much just by low prices at the checkout counter.
This philosophy became known as the Chicago School of Economics. Its core belief was that markets, if you just leave them alone, are incredibly efficient and they'll correct themselves. From this point of view, the government stepping in to try and protect small businesses was actually just getting in the way and making things worse. The only thing that mattered, the ultimate goal, was consumer welfare, and that meant one thing: low prices.
The real-world result of this shift was immediate and honestly profound. With this new, much narrower focus, antitrust enforcement just plummeted. Mergers that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier were suddenly getting the green light. Business practices that used to be called monopolistic were now being reframed as efficient. Corporate America got a whole lot bigger, and the government started looking the other way a lot more often.
Which brings us right up to today. The rise of the digital economy, and especially these giant tech platforms, has totally reignited the century-old debate. We're back to asking that original question all over again. What is antitrust for?
I mean, think about it. In a world where a handful of tech companies pretty much control the digital roads we all travel on, a lot of people are asking if a standard that only cares about low prices is good enough anymore. After all, so many of these services are technically free. So does that mean there's no problem?
A new group of thinkers, who are sometimes called the New Brandesians, point to a company like Amazon as the perfect example. They argue that Amazon used tactics like predatory pricing, selling ebooks at a loss, for instance, to just wipe out the competition. They point to the obvious conflict of Amazon running the entire marketplace while also competing against its own sellers on that very same marketplace. For them, Amazon's goal isn't just to be efficient, it's to dominate.
So now we have these two competing visions for what comes next. On one side, you have the consumer welfare standard, which asks that very simple question, are prices low? But on the other, you've got this push for a total welfare approach, which asks a much bigger set of questions. What's the impact on small businesses? What about innovation? And, just like Louis Brandeis asked a century ago, what about the effect on democracy itself?
So here we are, completely full circle. The debate we're having today about big tech feels almost identical to the debate our great-grandparents were having about the railroads and oil trusts. We're once again wrestling with the exact same fundamental questions that Theodore Roosevelt was facing.
Which leaves us with this final, really critical question. After more than a century of this back and forth, from Roosevelt's national parks all the way to our digital marketplaces, what should antitrust protect? Is it just about making sure you get the lowest price, or does its purpose run much, much deeper to protect our markets, our ability to innovate, and maybe, just maybe, our democracy?